but she didn't, and I wasn't entirely sure if I could blame her. I've never looked like such an asshole, and that's saying a lot. I fucked her, and left with next to no communication whatsoever. How could she feel anything but hate for me? She had a particular emptiness in her eyes the first time our gazes met in the bedroom, and I just knew I was fucked. It reminded me of how she looked that first night we met, tired, numb, and existing without living. Skinny. Too skinny. And pale. And she was still the most beautiful fucking thing I'd ever seen. A shuffle from behind me, followed by a familiar sigh, alerted me to Carlisle's presence on the stairs. Great, I thought bitterly at the fact he had seen any portion of what had just occurred. Add insult to injury. Looking back at my behavior as I begged Bella to listen to me on my knees was humiliating. My inhibitions were lost in the emotions that our reunion had produced. Now I felt like a complete moron, and there were witnesses. Perfect. I didn't turn to acknowledge him as I dropped my face into my hands, and mumbled aloud, "She hates me," as if this explained my theatrics, and absolved my shame. I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps grow closer, and then felt fingers in my hair, caressing my scalp gingerly. It was an oddly affectionate gesture that briefly puzzled me. It wasn't like him at all.
"Let me talk to her."
A feminine voice, that definitely wasn't Carlisle, startled me, and my head jerked toward the sound, above my head in fear. Esme stood over me, softly stroking my hair, and smiling at me warmly. Her Bella-like eyes were familiar and soulful, but didn't hold any of the disdain I'd expect. Her expression was one of motherly compassion, one I hadn't really seen bestowed upon me for 10 years. It was like I somehow been transported into some distorted version of the Forks' Twilight Zone. I rose slowly, infinitely more humiliated and uneasy. I darted my nervous eyes to Carlisle's, where he observed her maternal manner with an expression of elation. Yes, I decided. Definitely a Twilight Zone moment. My eyes followed her as she walked to Bella's door and knocked, softly requesting permission to enter. And then I panicked, wondering what she was going to say to her, how she was going to wedge us even farther apart than we already were, because that had to be her intention. She hated me, too. She continued knocking, and the sound of Bella's protests were heard through the wood. Esme turned toward Carlisle and me, and rolled her eyes, mouthing, "Girls." Carlisle chuckled softly, and I honestly didn't like the idea of her interfering, but was too chicken shit to say so. After a few moments of Esme's gentle persuasion, and an admittedly awkward tension that filled the hallway, the click of the lock sounded, and Esme was able to enter. Carlisle came to my side and stood, staring at the closed door with me as no sounds emerged. We waited for what felt like forever, neither of us speaking, as we strained to hear what was occurring inside. I wished for X-ray vision or super-sensitive hearing, or fucking mind reading. Abruptly, a shriek penetrated the walls, incredulous and disbelieving, and fiercely, "Bella! Are you freaking kidding me?" Carlisle tried to cajole me into eating dinner, but I didn't have an appetite. 4 hours later, Esme still hadn't emerged from Bella's room, and my unease multiplied with every passing minute she didn't. Carlisle kept insisting that he'd seen these two go at it before, and it was neither brief nor pleasant. The shrieks had ceased and filled the third floor, with a curious silence that unnerved me. I felt nervous wandering the house because it was uncomfortable. I still didn't know what Esme was playing at, and I cringed to think of the greeting I'd received from Alice. I stayed in the guest bedroom for the evening, because of these reasons. Also, it was as close to Bella as she'd let me get. I was fairly fucked where she was concerned, and spent too much of my time pondering various methods of returning to her good graces. I had plenty of time, after all. We lived in the same house. She couldn't simply avoid me forever, I reasoned, and I'd do anything. I'd follow her anywhere, and make sure I was the one to give her what she needed. I'd open pickle jars she couldn't budge, and get the plates from the top shelf she couldn't reach. If she'd ask, I'd humiliate myself in disturbing ways just to make her smile. I'd eat motherfucking dirt for Bella Swan. Dirt, bugs, all of that gross shit. As hopeless as it seemed, I continued concocting plots of grandeur, riding in on white fucking horse, and all that nonsense. It was ridiculous and pathetic. She had that effect on me. I was teetering on the line between acceptance and determination. Acceptance was a depressing admission of defeat that Bella might not ever be my girl again. That notion was unthinkable. But determination had its own fine line between sweetly endearing and really fucking creepy. The balance was impossible to find. And with the swell of individuals that now resided in the house, I was outnumbered with sighting parties. And there was still so much I wanted to know, like the matter that Carlisle and Bella had to attend to earlier, which he refused to explain, and what had been so monumental to her yesterday. I missed so much of everything, and now I felt intrusive and excluded, the outsider that I'd always wanted to be, except now I wanted in. At 10, I heard Esme surface. I was lying on the guest bed, in the dark so that I could see the light from under the door, when hers opened. I shot up from my position, and strained my ears to hear the movement of Esme descending the stairs. It was silent after that, and I contemplated going to her door. Unfortunately, giving her space seemed like the right thing to do, so I didn't. Doing the right thing often sucked like that, I noted. Instead, I lay on the bed and watched the sliver from under my door, hoping she'd emerge for something later that night. I waited for 2 hours, eyes fixed on the space between the carpet and the door, just hoping. I didn't know if she'd be sleeping, but there was no way I possibly could until she spoke to me again. I just knew my dreams would be worse, and so I decided to leave my mother. I knew it'd be awful and painful, and I had to have something that made it feel worth it before I could willingly subject myself to it. I pondered Bella's memories and nightmares. I imagined her falling asleep and awaking scared and frightened, and my chest stung. I'd go to her, I eventually decided. I'd break down the fucking door and lay with her to give her sleep. Maybe Esme would kill me, but it'd be worth it. By midnight my eyelids were fluttering, and my steady breathing was lulling me into sleep. The drive had been long and exhausted me. I was considering just surrendering when I saw the sliver my eyes had been fixed on slowly illuminate. I jolted myself back to complete consciousness so quickly that my fucking head spun. I listened to the soft thud of her footsteps and willed her with my mind to stop at my door and knock. She didn't, though. She just kept walking until she descended the stairs. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, and stood. I exited the room and decided to follow her, even though I realized I was crossing that fine line into really fucking creepy. I mean, there was always tomorrow to be all agonizingly considerate. I walked quietly through the dark house, expecting to find her in the kitchen, but coming up empty when it was just as dark as everything else. I was growing frustrated and desperate by the time I decided to check outside, and I felt like an idiot knowing that I likely wouldn't find her there. I was going to double back and see if she had managed to return to the bedroom without me noticing when I saw her. My heart fucking soared when I saw her dark silhouette beyond the gazebo. It was significant and meaningful to us, and she still went there. It was the first time since our confrontation that I felt a glimmer of hope. Then I remembered her words and how she basically told me that she hated me, and I felt nauseous. I swallowed and went to her, imagining that this was probably the end of everything at the exact place it all began. She was down by the riverbank when I reached the gazebo, and I spotted something black on the wooden table. I reached down and felt the cool leather of my jacket. I immediately dug in the pocket and extracted the small medallion that I'd fretted for so long over in Chicago. I tried to remind myself I still had Carlisle. I put it on because the midnight air felt cold and wet. In no hurry to have my fucking heart ripped out, I stepped up onto the bench and planted my ass on the table as I watched her. She was standing on the rocks, gazing out over the river with her arms folded across her chest. The dull silver of the scarce light didn't make her hair shimmer, or shine, or any of that stupid shit. It made her look gray, like my sketches. With what appeared to be a sigh, she finally turned to me, and began crossing the dark field between us. If I'd had the energy necessary, my muscles would have been coiled tight, bracing for the inevitability of that bitter frown that tainted her face. She never met my gaze as she approached, and chose a beam to lean against. She didn't want to be anywhere near me. This only fueled my nausea. My brows furrowed as she stared out over the water, and reached inside the chest of her hoodie. What she pulled out was a large, thick envelope, and she tossed it onto the table with an angry smack that startled me. She didn't even remove her eyes from the ripples of the water as I cautiously reached over and picked it up to inspect it. What I found inside were pages and pages of credit card statements, from May to September. I focused on the purchases I'd made to get some kind of an idea as to what she must be thinking. It was all pretty boring shit: cleaning supplies, food, gas, and cigarettes mostly, until the flowers were for my dad's grave, I explained, breaking the silence of ruffling papers abruptly. It was a little presumptuous of me to assume that she'd think they were for some other girl, but I felt compelled to assure her. She tucked a lock of wayward hair behind her hair, and nodded without meeting my gaze. I frowned as I returned the sheets of paper to the envelope, at a loss. I didn't know what she wanted. That mind-reading thing would have come in really handy right about now. Knowing my luck, she'd be the only person in existence immune to it. She wouldn't look me in the eye.
You left me,
she suddenly whispered, accusing. Her fists were balled up tight below her ribcage as she hugged her torso. I could feel my eyes and jaw tighten. I'm here, now, I defended, unable to argue this. Her eyes abruptly jerked sideways, meeting my gaze, and flashing with what some might mistake for fury, if they didn't know better. I did.
You just don't get it,
she spat, the false fury she projecting forcing me to swallow thickly.
You just left me, and if you would have thrown your ring in my face and told me it was over, I would have been better off,
she growled, and in a much softer, sadder voice added,
at least then I wouldn't have been.
Her voice broke, and she shifted her gaze back to the river without concluding. Her eyes were suddenly reflecting months full of something that I couldn't even really comprehend, and I fucking hated not knowing the depth of it. I had this weird and really annoying moment of mental stupefaction, in which I couldn't find an appropriate response, and my feeling of estrangement swelled to a frustrating degree. I mean, she had basically just admitted that I'd ended us, or at least that she'd been thinking I had for God only knows how long. I couldn't think of anything to say that wasn't full of anger and self-disgust. The fact that this whole conversation felt like it might decide the fate of my entire fucking future with her wasn't really helping, either. It was an unbelievable amount of pressure. Uncertain and cautious, I responded in a breathy whisper. That I wasn't sure I even wanted her to understand. Just because I was gone, doesn't mean I wasn't yours. I really wanted to ask her if she was mine, but figured I wasn't ready for the answer to that just yet. She stood motionless against the wooden beam with no indication that she gave a shit.
You're an asshole,
she whispered, the muscles in her jaw twitching and taut. I dropped my head in shame and sighed. Yep, I agreed. But I'm trying really hard not to be, I declared, searching her features for consideration, and finding none. Her hair whipped around her face with a strong breeze, and my fingers twitched to brush it back.
You should have let me in,
she spoke to the river, still and unrelenting in her refusal to meet my gaze.
I would have understood if you just called, or something, but…
She abruptly paused, and then seemed as if she wouldn't continue. But she couldn't understand. But she couldn't forgive me. But she hated me now. The silence drew on and I grew frustrated and angry that she couldn't complete her sentence. I was uncertain whether or not her response would be wise, but I needed her to know I wasn't just shutting her out. It occurred to me that as much as I felt like excluded from all of the little knowledge of her life during the past months, she felt like an outsider in mine. I wondered how I could ever possibly convey how much I'd been through to get here to this moment with her, and if it would make any difference. That desperation was beginning to mount, and I figured I could use her silence to finally try. With a deep breath I began. When I got to Chicago, and found my mother, she was very… She cut me off with a terse reply.
Esme told me everything. Bella's point of view. Esme told me everything, I interrupted, not knowing if I could handle hearing it all over again. The waves of the river rippled with a soothing slush that his velvet voice didn't disrupt. I was curious if my confession had made him angry with her, but I didn't look at him. I couldn't, in the same way that I couldn't be near to his electric hum. I couldn't think clearly with the distraction his proximity brought. When Esme had entered my bedroom hours earlier, I'd expected her disapproval of Edward's affections toward me to comfort the